Her Royal Highness Princess Charlotte. She is, of course, third in line to the throne. She is, of course, the daughter of the Prince and Princess of Wales.
Look, it's nice, but it's a 9-year-old girl who's having a birthday.
Princess Charlotte and Anne finally reveal the house papers Camilla hid from Charles for years. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because the title points to something far more serious than an argument over an old house. According to the story being examined here, Princess Charlotte and Princess Anne allegedly came across a collection of historical property papers containing agreements, correspondence, and financial records that appeared to conflict with what King Charles understood about a royal residence. The disturbing part was not simply what the papers reportedly said, it was the suggestion that Queen Camilla may have known about the disputed arrangement, while Charles had never been shown the complete documents. Now, watch this closely. The issue reportedly became impossible to ignore when one provision inside the papers appeared to challenge the family's understanding of who had rights connected to the residence. Anne, known for her direct and practical approach to family matters, allegedly insisted that the documents be examined rather than quietly put away. Then Charlotte became part of the story, bringing a much older dispute directly into the orbit of the younger generation. And that is what makes this different. This was not just another disagreement whispered behind palace doors. The alleged problem was sitting on paper, carrying dates, names, and terms that could force a completely different question. Why had Charles never been given the whole file? Take a look at what that means. If the reported documents were genuine and their contents were understood correctly, then the central issue was no longer simply who controlled a residence. It became a question of information, trust, and who had been allowed to decide what the king needed to know. Senior advisors were reportedly concerned that opening the matter could create a family confrontation. The warning, according to the story, was simple: leave the papers alone. Keep the dispute private. Do not turn an old property arrangement into a new royal crisis. But Anne allegedly reached the opposite conclusion. If the papers raised a serious question about the king's own understanding, then silence could become more damaging than disclosure. Hi viewers, if you were handed papers proving that something important had been kept from a member of your own family for years, would you stay silent just to keep the peace? Type yes if you think the truth should come out, or no if you think family secrets should sometimes remain private. And if you believe Charles deserved to see the complete story, like this video, share it with someone who follows royal controversies, and subscribe, because refusing to look away is the only way stories like this keep getting examined. Because the most unsettling part of the allegation comes next. The papers reportedly did not appear out of nowhere. They were described as historical records connected to a residence whose arrangements had existed for years. That means there was a timeline behind them. There were decisions made before Charlotte was old enough to understand them. There were people who may have known about those decisions long before she ever encountered the documents. And there was one name that reportedly kept appearing around the question of why the arrangement had never been placed fully before Charles.
This is the private sitting room for the Princess Royal Princess Anne. She has opened up the room and opened up her schedule to do something she rarely does, conduct an interview with us about things she doesn't often talk about.
Camilla. That name changes the temperature of the entire story. The allegation is not that a piece of paper simply appeared and suddenly proved wrongdoing. It is more complicated than that. The story suggests that Camilla may have been aware of the disputed arrangements and may have chosen not to bring the complete papers to Charles. That remains an allegation, not an established fact. There has been no basis in the supplied material to treat the claim as a confirmed finding. But within the story, that possibility is precisely what makes Anne's decision so significant. Because Anne was not allegedly looking at one mysterious page and making a dramatic accusation. She was reportedly looking at a chain of documents, a property agreement, correspondence surrounding the arrangement, financial records, references to rights connected with the residence. pieces of information that might appear harmless when separated, but which could become deeply uncomfortable when placed beside one another. And that is where the first real crack appears. One document reportedly suggested an arrangement that did not fit neatly with the family's assumed understanding of the property. Another appeared to raise questions about who had known about that arrangement. Then came the question that reportedly stopped being theoretical. Had Charles ever seen everything? Not a summary, not a verbal explanation, not a carefully prepared briefing, the complete papers. That distinction matters because royal disputes rarely begin with someone standing in a room and announcing that they are starting a war. They begin quietly. A document gets filed. A decision gets described as temporary. A private agreement remains private. Someone assumes another person knows. Years pass. People change positions. The people who originally handled the matter move on, and eventually, someone younger finds the paper and asks the question nobody thought would ever be asked again. That is reportedly where Charlotte's discovery becomes important.
It always has been one of the remarkable features that international competition equal between men and women. It took a little bit longer, not that much.
Her involvement does not mean she personally uncovered every part of the alleged dispute. The supplied story does not establish that. What it does present is the younger generation coming into contact with an old set of papers that had remained outside the family's wider discussion. And once that happened, the matter could no longer remain comfortably buried in the past. Charlotte represents something the older members of the family cannot escape. Time moves. The people who made the original decisions are aging. The people who will inherit the consequences are growing into positions of influence. And a document that seemed insignificant 20 years ago can suddenly become extremely important when the people reading it are no longer the same people who signed it. Anne understood that reportedly, she did not need a public confrontation, she did not need cameras, she did not need a statement from the palace, she needed the papers examined properly. That is why the story's tension does not come from shouting. It comes from silence. Someone allegedly knew something, someone allegedly did not. And somewhere between those two facts sits a collection of documents that could explain the entire dispute. The question now is what exactly was hidden inside those pages, and why would anyone have wanted Charles to remain unaware of the full arrangement for so long? Because if the next document says what the story suggests it says, this stops being a disagreement about a house and becomes a question about who was controlling the truth around the king. And if that possibility matters to you, do not click away now, because the next part goes deeper into the papers Anne allegedly examined, and that is where the story gets much harder to explain away. The property dispute became harder to dismiss when the papers were placed beside the history of the residence itself. That history mattered because ownership was never just a technical question. A royal residence can carry family expectations, private agreements, inheritance plans, and assumptions about who has authority over what. When those assumptions survive for years without being tested, even one old clause can become dangerous. The reported papers were said to contain several different kinds of records. There were property agreements, correspondence, and financial material connected to the residence. None of those categories is extraordinary by itself. Houses generate paperwork constantly. What made this collection different was the alleged relationship between the documents. Read separately, each record could look routine. Read together, they reportedly raised questions about an arrangement that had never been fully discussed inside the wider family. That distinction is crucial. The story does not depend on one sensational sentence hidden at the bottom of a page. It depends on a pattern, a provision in an agreement, a reference in correspondence, a financial record that appears to follow the same arrangement. Then another document that seems to confirm that the arrangement continued. The more pages were reportedly placed together, the harder it became to treat the issue as an isolated misunderstanding. And there was another problem. The residence had existed within a family structure where private property and royal responsibilities could overlap without becoming identical. A person could have a personal interest in a house while still living within the demands of royal life. A property could be associated with a senior royal without automatically becoming an institutional asset. That distinction gave the alleged arrangement room to exist for years without attracting the kind of attention that a palace dispute normally receives. This is where the story surrounding Camilla becomes more complicated. The supplied account alleges that she knew about the disputed arrangements but did not bring the complete papers to Charles. That claim has not been established here as a proven fact. It remains part of the reported narrative. But if the allegation were accurate, the reason for keeping the matter quiet becomes just as important as the document itself. There are several possible explanations. Someone could have believed the arrangement was already settled. Someone could have considered the paperwork a private family matter. Someone could have assumed Charles understood the broader arrangement without seeing every historical document. Or, more seriously, someone could have decided that giving him the complete file would create a problem that was easier to postpone. Those possibilities cannot simply be treated as identical. The difference between forgetting to show a document and deliberately withholding it is enormous. One is an administrative failure, the other is a question of trust. That is why the chronology matters so much. According to the story premise, the disputed arrangement was not new when Charlotte and Anne encountered the papers. It had roots in earlier decisions. That meant the people now examining the documents were dealing with choices made by people who may have expected the matter to remain settled indefinitely. But time had changed the stakes. The royal family was no longer looking at the residents through exactly the same lens. The people involved had different responsibilities. The younger generation was moving closer to the center of royal life. Charles was king. Anne remained one of the family's most experienced figures. Charlotte was growing into a future role that would make questions of inheritance and family property increasingly relevant. That is why an old paper could suddenly become a current problem. The issue was not simply what happened years ago. The issue was whether the consequences of that decision were still active now. Anne reportedly understood that distinction. She was not looking for gossip, she was looking for continuity. If an agreement had created rights connected to the residents, then those rights needed to be understood. If later documents had changed those rights, that needed to be understood too. And if correspondence showed that senior family members had known about the arrangement, the dates mattered. Who received the document? Who signed it? Who was informed? What happened afterward? Those questions sound administrative. Inside a family as closely watched as the royal family, they can become explosive. The alleged records also raised another issue involving money. Financial documents can reveal whether an arrangement was merely theoretical or whether people acted on it. A property agreement can sit untouched for years. Payments, maintenance decisions, or other financial records can show that somebody continued to treat the agreement as meaningful. That is why the financial material reportedly attracted attention. If money had been spent under one understanding of the residents, while the legal or historical papers suggested another, the contradiction would need an explanation. It would not automatically prove wrongdoing. It would not establish that anyone had acted improperly, but it would create a question that could not be answered with a simple verbal reassurance. And that appears to be the point at which the alleged dispute became more serious.
My mother was the Queen for a very long time. And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity.
Because the documents were no longer telling one story. They were reportedly telling several stories that had to be reconciled. The property agreement described one arrangement. The correspondence appeared to provide context. The financial records appeared to show how the arrangement functioned in practice. Put together, they created a timeline. That timeline is what Anne allegedly wanted examined, and this is where the story takes its first real turn. If the papers had merely shown an old family arrangement, there would have been little reason to involve the wider family. The issue could have remained with solicitors or property advisors. But if the documents suggested that Charles had never received the complete picture, then the question moved beyond property administration. It became a question of whether the king had been properly informed about an asset connected to his own family. That possibility explains why advisors were reportedly uneasy. A private property disagreement can be resolved quietly. A disagreement about what the king knew is different. It touches trust. It touches decision-making. It touches the relationship between Charles and the people closest to him. And it creates one uncomfortable possibility. What if the most important page in the file was not the page describing who had rights to the residence? What if it was the page showing when someone already knew those rights existed? The answer could also explain why the papers reportedly remained outside ordinary family discussion for so long. If the original arrangement was considered settled, then nobody may have expected it to be challenged. But once a new generation encountered the records, that assumption was no longer safe. Charlotte's involvement therefore mattered less because of her position and more because she represented the moment when an old decision was being examined by people who had not made it. They could read the same pages without carrying the assumptions of those who created them. That made the next step unavoidable. The documents needed to be dated, compared, and traced back to the people who handled them. Only then could anyone begin separating an innocent administrative decision from a deliberate choice to keep Charles outside the full story completely. That is the detail that allegedly changed the direction of Anne's review. Because once the dates began to line up, the question was no longer simply what the family had agreed to, it was who knew first. And if you think a family should not be allowed to bury an important truth simply because the paperwork is old, then like this video and share it. Do not let the uncomfortable questions disappear just because they involve powerful people, because the next part goes directly into the timeline that could make this entire dispute far more difficult to explain away. The answer did not arrive with a dramatic announcement. It emerged from the way the documents were arranged. By this point, Anne reportedly had enough material to see that the disputed residence could not be understood from a single agreement. The papers had to be read as a sequence. One document established an arrangement. Another appeared to explain how that arrangement was handled later. The correspondence provided context. The financial records raised further questions. Together, they created something more troubling than a disagreement over wording. They created a trail, and trails have beginnings. The first task was reportedly to establish when the disputed provision appeared and whether later records referred back to it. That sounds simple until a family arrangement has existed for years. People change roles, advisors change, documents move between offices, private decisions become accepted practice. Eventually, everyone can remember the arrangement without remembering exactly why it began. Anne reportedly wanted the opposite. She needed the original terms. She needed the later correspondence. And she needed to know who had been informed at each stage. That was when Charlotte's role became more significant. The younger royal had not created the dispute. She had not negotiated the original property arrangement. She was not responsible for the decisions made years earlier. What made her involvement important was that she was encountering the material without having been part of the old assumptions surrounding it. That can change how a document looks. Someone who has lived with an arrangement for years may see an unusual clause and think nothing of it. Someone seeing it for the first time may stop immediately and ask why it is there. According to the story, that is reportedly what happened. Charlotte's discovery raised questions that could not be answered simply by saying the arrangement was old. Age did not make the provision disappear. If anything, the passage of time made its existence more important, because it meant the same understanding may have continued for years without being challenged. Anne reportedly recognized the danger of drawing conclusions too quickly. She did not need to accuse anyone. She needed to establish the facts inside the story. That meant comparing the documents against one another. One paper reportedly described rights connected to the residents. Another appeared to contain language that could affect how those rights were understood. The correspondence reportedly suggested that people involved in the arrangement were aware of the issue. Then the financial records added another layer by showing that the property was being treated according to arrangements that did not appear completely straightforward. None of those details, individually, proves deliberate concealment. But together, they create a question that refuses to disappear. Who knew? That question reportedly became the center of Anne's attention. Not who owned the house. Not who lived there. Not who had the strongest emotional claim. Who knew what the papers said, and when? That distinction matters because the title of this story turns on an alleged act of withholding, not merely on an old property dispute. The supplied story alleges that Camilla knew about the disputed arrangements and did not show the complete papers to Charles. That remains an allegation within this account. The documents described here are not independently established as proof of wrongdoing, but the alleged chronology is what gives the story its force. If Camilla had been aware of the provision before Charles was shown it, then there would be a direct question about why. If she had not been aware of the full details herself, then the story changes again. The people handling the property may have failed to bring the matter forward. If Charles had been given a summary, but not the complete records, then another explanation would be required. Several possibilities remained open. Anne reportedly did not accept the easiest answer simply because it was convenient. That was the point at which the advisor's concern became understandable. Any serious examination of the papers could force the family to revisit decisions that had been treated as settled. And once the question of Charles's knowledge entered the discussion, keeping the matter private became much harder. Because Charles was not just another relative. He was the king. If a property arrangement affected the interests of the royal family, and the king had never been given the complete documentation, then the matter had implications far beyond one residence. It raised a larger issue about how information moved around him. Who filtered it? Who decided what required his attention? Who decided what could wait? And who had the authority to decide that an old property paper was not important enough for him to see? Those questions reportedly brought the matter closer to Camilla. The story does not establish a confirmed confrontation between Camilla and Anne at this stage. What it does establish, within the supplied premise, is that Camilla became central to the allegation because she was said to have known about the disputed arrangement. That made every earlier explanation more difficult. If the matter was harmless, why had it remained so poorly understood? If the arrangement was routine, why did the complete documents matter so much once Charlotte and Anne examined them? If Charles already knew, why was there uncertainty about whether he had seen the full file? And if he did not know, who decided that he did not need to know? There was still one piece missing: the date. Not simply the date of the original property agreement, but the date on which the disputed arrangement was known, discussed, or carried forward. That date could separate coincidence from sequence. It could show whether the people involved were acting before or after important family decisions. It could reveal whether the papers were merely forgotten or whether they had been deliberately kept outside the king's view. Anne reportedly understood that. So instead of turning the matter into a public accusation, she continued with the documents. The papers were reportedly placed in chronological order. The names were compared. The correspondence was read against the agreements. The financial records were checked against the property arrangements. And then one date reportedly stood out. It appeared to place knowledge of the disputed provision earlier than expected. That was the moment the story changed. Until then, there was a property question. Now there was a knowledge question. And a knowledge question inside the royal family can become far more dangerous than a question about a house. Charlotte's presence made that development even more uncomfortable. The younger generation was now looking at a decision that belonged to an earlier era, while the people responsible for explaining it were still close enough to be asked directly. Anne reportedly reached the point where another question became unavoidable. Had Charles ever been shown the complete papers? Not a summary, not an explanation, the actual documents. Because if the answer was no, then the title's most serious allegation could no longer be treated as a simple misunderstanding. And this is where the next revelation becomes critical. The papers reportedly contained more than an old provision. They appeared to connect that provision to knowledge held by someone close to Charles himself. That person was Camilla. The allegations still required caution. The documents, as presented in the story, did not automatically prove intent. They did not establish why information was allegedly withheld, but they reportedly created enough uncertainty for Anne to demand a direct answer. That was the question nobody could comfortably postpone anymore. If Camilla knew, why was Charles never shown the complete file? And if she did not know, who had kept the truth buried? And there was another reason the discovery mattered. Anne was not approaching the papers as a curiosity. She was reportedly testing whether Charles's understanding had been shaped by incomplete information. If that was true, then the residence was only the visible part of a larger problem, the machinery surrounding Charles and decisions made in his name. The answer was reportedly waiting inside the next set of papers, and that is where this story stops being about a disputed residence and starts becoming a battle over trust. The page that changed everything was not the oldest document in the file. It was the one that appeared to connect the disputed arrangement to a point in time when the people involved should have known exactly what was happening. Anne reportedly stopped at that page. The wording mattered, so did the date, so did the sequence of documents surrounding it. Until that moment, there had still been room for an innocent explanation. An old arrangement could have been misunderstood. A solicitor could have handled something without explaining every detail to the family. A document could have been filed and forgotten. A financial record could have been connected to a completely separate decision. But the chronology reportedly made those explanations harder to sustain. The papers suggested that knowledge of the disputed provision may have existed before the issue ever reached the wider family discussion. And once that possibility appeared, Anne reportedly wanted one answer above everything else. Had Charles been told? The question was simple. The consequences were not. If he had been told, then the dispute was largely about interpretation. If he had not been told, then somebody had decided that the king did not need the complete information. That is where Camilla's alleged involvement became impossible to ignore. The story presented her as someone who was aware of the arrangement and its implications. But awareness alone does not prove concealment. A person can know about a property arrangement without understanding every legal consequence. A person can also believe another advisor has already informed the relevant family member. Those possibilities had to be considered. Anne reportedly did not treat suspicion as proof. She looked for confirmation. That meant returning to the correspondence. The letters mattered because they could reveal what people actually understood at the time. Property agreements can be technical. Correspondence can show whether the people signing them understood their meaning. A casual reference can sometimes be more revealing than an entire formal agreement because it shows what people considered normal. According to the story premise, some of the correspondence reportedly suggested that the disputed arrangement was not unknown to those closest to it. That did not answer the central question. It sharpened it. If the arrangement was known, why had Charles allegedly not been shown the complete file? And if Charles had been deliberately excluded, who made that decision? The answers now had to be separated from the emotion surrounding the family. Anne reportedly understood that too. She did not need to decide whether Camilla was right or wrong. She needed to establish what happened. That distinction protected the investigation from becoming a family argument before the facts were understood. But the longer the papers were examined, the more uncomfortable the picture became. There was reportedly an old agreement. There were later references to it. There were financial records connected to the residence. There was correspondence that appeared to acknowledge the arrangement. And then there was the question of Charles. The king's name was conspicuous because the alleged problem was not that he had disagreed with the arrangement. The problem was that he may never have been given the complete information needed to disagree with it. That is a very different accusation. It changes the entire balance of the story. A disagreement means two people know the facts and reach different conclusions. Withholding information means one person may be making decisions without seeing the same facts as the other. That was reportedly what concerned Anne most. And it also explained why the story had reached the younger generation. Charlotte had not inherited the original dispute. She had inherited its consequences. That distinction gave the discovery a different weight. The residence was part of an older family arrangement, but the people who would eventually live with the consequences were not the people who created it. Charlotte represented a future royal family that would have to understand decisions made decades earlier. If the papers were accurate, then the younger generation was not simply discovering family history, they were discovering the unfinished business of that history. And that is precisely why Anne reportedly refused to let the documents disappear back into a filing system. The advisors who wanted the issue kept private had a practical argument. A property dispute could become a public controversy. A public controversy involving Charles and Camilla could become a constitutional distraction. The royal family had no shortage of public pressure already. Why create another? But Anne's alleged position was more direct. Privacy could not be allowed to replace clarity. If Charles had been properly informed, the matter could be settled. If he had not, then he deserved to know. That position put the papers on a collision course with the people who preferred the issue to remain quiet. And that is where the story reached its most uncomfortable stage. Someone had to take the information to Charles. The question was who? Anne reportedly had the strongest reason to do it herself. She had examined the material. She understood the chronology. She knew that simply handing the file to an advisor could result in another layer of interpretation between the documents and the king. The story therefore places Anne at the center of the next move. Not because she wanted publicity, not because she wanted to embarrass Camilla, but because the person allegedly left out of the complete picture was Charles himself, and the next stage would force the family to confront something it had been able to avoid for years. The king would have to see the papers, not a summary, not a carefully worded explanation. The papers themselves. That is where the emotional pressure begins to rise. Because once Charles sees the original documents, there is no longer room for someone else to decide what he should know. He can read the dates. 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 Correspondence. He can read the dates. 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 And then he can ask the one question that nobody else can answer for him. Why was this never placed in front of him? That question carries far more weight than the property itself. A house can be transferred. An agreement can be renegotiated. A financial arrangement can be reviewed. Trust is harder. Once someone begins wondering whether information was deliberately kept from them, every earlier explanation can look different. A harmless omission can begin to look deliberate. A routine decision can begin to look calculated. A private arrangement can begin to look like something that was protected from scrutiny. The story does not establish that these interpretations are true. It establishes the allegation and the questions raised by the reported documents. But those questions were reportedly serious enough to move Anne from examination to action. And that was the moment Charlotte's discovery became something much bigger than an old house dispute. The younger generation had found the thread. Anne had pulled it. Now the entire question was moving toward Charles. The next document reportedly carried the detail that could determine whether this was simply a misunderstood family arrangement or something far more troubling. Because it did not merely concern who had rights to the residence. It reportedly showed when those rights became known. And once Charles saw that date, the question would no longer be whether the papers mattered. It would be whether someone had allowed him to live for years without knowing what those papers actually said. If you believe Charles had the right to see the full truth for himself, do not let this story end with a question mark. Like, share, and subscribe, because the next part is where the papers reportedly reach Charles, and what follows is far more uncomfortable than the property dispute itself. The final question was no longer about the house. It was about Charles. Once the papers had reportedly reached him, the dispute changed shape. The residence remained important, but it was no longer the center of the argument. The real issue was whether the king had been allowed to understand an arrangement that allegedly concerned his own family and his own interests. The story does not establish exactly what Charles said in private, and no responsible account can invent his reaction. What matters is the question the papers reportedly placed before him. If the documents were as significant as Anne believed, why had the complete record not reached him earlier? That question could not be answered by pointing toward the age of the paperwork. Old documents do not become irrelevant simply because they have spent years in a drawer. In some cases, time makes them more important. The longer an arrangement survives, the more people depend on it. The more people depend on it, the greater the consequences when somebody discovers that the original understanding may have been incomplete. That was the pressure now surrounding the family. Charlotte's involvement gave the story another dimension. She belonged to a generation that would inherit the consequences of decisions made before she had any role in royal life. Anne, meanwhile, had spent decades watching family arrangements become institutional habits. Their positions were different, but the question confronting them was the same. What happens when the paperwork tells a different story from the one everyone has been living with? The alleged answer was uncomfortable. The papers reportedly suggested that the residence was subject to arrangements that were not fully reflected in the family's wider understanding. They reportedly raised questions about rights, financial responsibilities, and the knowledge of those closest to Charles. None of that automatically proves that Camilla deliberately concealed anything. That remains an allegation within this story. But the fact that the allegation could be raised at all was enough to force a closer examination. And that is where the meaning of the title becomes clear. Princess Charlotte did not need to accuse anyone. Princess Anne did not need to publicly condemn anyone. They allegedly did something more consequential. They brought an old question back into the light. The papers could no longer remain an abstract family matter, because Charles had reportedly been placed in a position where he could examine the information himself. The decision about what the documents meant could finally belong to the person whose knowledge had been questioned. That changed the balance. If Charles accepted that he had known enough, the controversy could fade. If he discovered that important information had been omitted, then the family would have to confront why. Either way, the papers had achieved something that years of private discussion apparently had not. They forced the question into the open. Camilla's position also becomes more complicated here. She could be viewed as someone protecting a long-standing private family arrangement. She could be viewed as someone who believed the matter was settled and did not need to be reopened. Or, under the allegation at the heart of this story, she could have known more than Charles and chosen not to place the full record before him. Those interpretations lead to completely different conclusions. The available story does not provide enough evidence to declare which one is true. It is actually what makes the story worth examining, because the most powerful question is not whether Camilla is guilty of some secret act. The most powerful question is whether the people surrounding Charles gave him the information he needed to make his own judgment. That question reaches far beyond one residence. It touches every private arrangement that can affect a family when the people involved carry public responsibilities. It raises questions about trust, communication, inheritance, and the quiet power of advisors who decide what deserves attention. And it explains Anne's importance. She reportedly refused to let the matter be reduced to palace language. She wanted the documents examined. She wanted the dates understood. She wanted Charles to know what the papers actually contained. That is a very different role from starting a family feud. It is closer to forcing accountability without creating a spectacle. The papers were no longer simply about what happened years ago. They were about what the next generation would inherit, understand, and possibly have to resolve. The residence therefore became a symbol, not simply of property, not simply of money, but of what happens when private decisions survive long enough to become family history. The story began with a house paper. It ends with trust. That is why the alleged revelation matters. If the documents were misunderstood, then the family has an opportunity to clarify the record. If the documents were accurate but poorly communicated, then the lesson is about transparency. If the allegation of deliberate concealment were ever proven, the consequences would be far more serious because the dispute would no longer concern a property arrangement. It would concern the integrity of the information given to the king himself. For now, the evidence presented in this story does not establish that final conclusion. What it does establish within the narrative is a question powerful enough to survive every attempt to close the file. Who knew? Who was told? Who was not told? And why? Those 4 questions are more important than any dramatic headline because they lead directly to the human issue underneath the royal story. A family can survive an argument about a house. It can survive a disagreement about money. It can even survive an awkward document. What becomes harder to survive is the suspicion that someone close to you knew the truth and decided you did not need to see it. That is the shadow hanging over this story. Charlotte reportedly brought the old papers into view. Anne reportedly refused to let them disappear again. Charles was reportedly confronted with the question what he had actually been told. The distinction matters because royal controversy often survives on implication. A missing explanation can become more powerful than a confirmed statement. That is why the papers matter here. They reportedly gave shape to questions that had existed only as suspicion, and once questions acquire dates and documents, they become harder to dismiss. And Camilla remained at the center of the allegation that the complete picture had been kept from him. Whether that allegation ultimately survives scrutiny is another matter. But the documents, the questions, and the family tension described in this story point toward one unavoidable lesson. Paperwork does not care about rank. It does not care who is king. It does not care who is queen. It simply records what was agreed, when it was agreed, and sometimes what people hoped nobody would ask about later. That is why this story does not really end with the residents. It ends with the question the papers forced the family to face. Was Charles given the whole truth? And if he was not, who decided that he should not see it? If you believe powerful families should not be allowed to bury difficult questions behind silence, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, like this video, and share it with someone who refuses to look away. Because staying silent lets uncomfortable questions disappear, while your support keeps them alive. And the next royal story coming to this channel goes even deeper, with another revelation that may be harder to explain.